So first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that this video and the points I'm making are somewhat derivative. I came to these observations and conclusions basically after consuming a few different analysis videos and theories from different One Piece content creators on YouTube, and just kind of mix it up in my head, and this is the points and analysis that I've got to give, so we shall proceed. So the general consensus, which I also subscribe to, would be that Sanji is the most varied and versatile of the main characters in One Piece. He has a strong balance of comedy, depth or drama, and seriousness, which is basically affinity to action. And I think this part is spoken about very well in the Grand Line Reviews video on this subject, so I'll make sure that's linked in the description. However, with the scale of the story expanding so significantly post-time skip, the balance of these attributes means that the storytelling pace and structure is going to be subject to some change. This is because the overarching stories of each arc are smaller components of the larger stories they're included within. I'll refer to Mr. Morj's explanation of arc versus saga or super saga storytelling. With this, the scale of events of each arc are reduced, and where this in particular comes into effect for Sanji is in his payoffs. Since each arc isn't really its own story as in the pre-time skip, payoffs in general become smaller and less often in terms of how the story is moving. Now, this in and of itself isn't a problem. It would undercut the major achievements and payoffs if this wasn't the case. It's also why Oda can afford to do things like split the crew up or focus on a larger roster of new characters more often. The gaps between major story deciding events are just naturally larger. But with that being the case, the balance of any individual character's depiction also changes in its structure. And by that I mean how and when certain parts of their character are included. The drama, the seriousness, the gags, the action, and all of that. And with that being subject to change due to how the structure of the storytelling has evolved, it exposes a pretty unique trait when it comes to the characterization of Sanji. This is because payoffs mean the most to Sanji. Why? Firstly, because Sanji's primary character flaw is intrinsically linked to his gag. Since Sanji's gag and flaw are connected, his gag negatively affects his depiction, and this is especially potent when it directly affects the story, i.e. when Oda makes Sanji a plot device as often as he does. This does so to varying degrees depending on the circumstances and instance, but they add up to form the dips to his character over time as the story progresses between major events. But what do I mean by negatively affecting his depiction? Sanji's issues with women, perversions, and self-sacrificial nature are both a gag and a plot device, and therefore affects the story, which pretty much cements the flaw in our exposure to the story. It's harder to ignore or forget as it's tied to the very flow of the story, and thus the events that it's contributed to creating. This invokes more negative feelings and emotions overall, and these remain associated with the character and his place in the story as it's told. Sanji fans like myself empathize and suffer alongside the character in his conflicts in cases like Whole Cake Island or maybe in the Black Maria situation, just for more recent examples. People that dislike Sanji are annoyed at him for his actions, or maybe just annoyed at him seemingly stalling the story. And for anyone in between, I imagine it can just seem somewhat repetitive at the worst of times. The thing that compounds this to such a turbulent degree is the gag. Both his gag and his flaw are associated with women and self-sacrifice, so the resultant frustration, irritation, or whatever negative emotions may arise are somewhat compounded upon in those occasions where it relates to this flaw, even when we do get those more genuine moments. This is pretty much only the case for Sanji. If you really think about it, there's never any real peril or threat to progression because of, say, Zoro's loss of direction or aversion to stairs, or because Nami got greedy, or Usopp lied, or Brook's perversions. I could go on, but those are more throwaway and isolated as a result. It barely even happens for Luffy as the main character, but for Sanji it ends up being more frequent, which does accumulate, and they tend to include him suffering, whether seriously or not so seriously. Why this is so different for Luffy versus Sanji, as an example to make my overall point, is in the payoffs. These dips to characterization in these more negatively depicted moments are marked and overcome by payoffs in both the characters' arcs in story and the audience reception to these, let's call them dips. Where Luffy has moments that question his leadership or maturity, for example, they tend to raise the question for Luffy to eventually and inevitably meet the standard as an answer. And when this happens, it cements that progression and growth. And since Luffy is the main character who's always going to have major fights, these dips that necessitate these payoffs are never that long and yet are still made up for massively. And to reiterate, this flaw is only scarcely related to recurring gags, so the dips aren't even that low or that frequent. So they never really feel like they stack in the way that it does for Sanji. The other character that comes to mind whose depiction suffers in this way is Big Mom, and it's no coincidence that she's one of the more polarizing characters due to the contrasting presentations of her character power and competence. She also has these dips in depiction, often relating to or just straight up being a gag, occasionally in quite contrived plot-like ways. Her depiction suffers. It's hard to forget or ignore, with little and key consequential moments where her actions actually affect the plot to answer these questions that are raised as these dips. But yeah, back on topic. Sanji, in his varied and ever-changing role in the story, arguably suffers the longest and most frequent of these dips between payoffs, which the new storytelling format of post-time skip has really exacerbated, with no real major payoffs to overcome these struggles and straight up foolishness. And the main issue is Oda's love of the gag, since it again ties to his primary character flaw. It can somewhat undercut the implied growth following these character arcs and payoffs, especially when post-time skip the gags have become more straight perverted rather than stark shifts or large contrasts in particular behaviors. You can see Mr. Morj's analysis on Sanji for this particular subject, because I pretty much agree with everything in that video. But yeah, because that's the case, these dips are larger, and then we've got smaller payoffs, as we're still leading up to the end of the first main actual overarching story, the 4 Yonko saga. So when it comes to payoffs, what do I mean by saying that they're smaller? Why do people want Sanji to finally get a W in combat so damn badly? These questions lead me to another of my main points. Strength or power in a story is the ability to affect the plot, and in a shonen battle manga, that is combat strength. Sanji is one of the top tier combatants on the crew at that number 3 spot, but since we have a super saga and not just a saga, there can't be a major boss fight in an arc leading up to the conclusive arc, or arcs, of that saga. That was a lot of using the same words. The progression wouldn't be natural if the whole crew needed everything they had for Doflamingo, only to then challenge Big Mom and Kaido right after. But Sanji isn't Zoro. He can and does lose. His flaws and falls are very much a part of his character. His drive isn't solely strength-based. It's part of what makes him come across as more human and thus so compelling to many of us. He's just an ordinary guy that fucks up and suffers in many ways and places, but when it comes down to it, he is strong. He can rise to the occasion, overcome that pain and suffering, and stand next to the real powerhouses. That in concept is the greatest and most rewarding Sanji payoff. But that peak moment has to be in something of a boss fight, which won't come until the end of the conclusive saga, which we're nearing now, but it still hasn't come or been led up to. No, we're thrown into more Sanji and women dilemmas and forced to watch him suffer in ways that seem repetitive and without real meaning, which as a plot point or plot device alone is just played out, and as a gag just adds to that negative depiction, further adding to that already insane desire or need for some payoff to it all. These moments also came after a fake out when it comes to the audience perspective, where we get an off-screen clash with a pretty strong character, which turned out to be inconsequential. Even if, say, we're at the Fire Festival and reintroduced to page 1, and he makes a comment about how he's now weak because of the beating he got from Sanji to some degree. That would have meant that Sanji's actions and autonomy was actually consequential, and would have acted minimally as some kind of payoff, or just picking up his depiction a little bit in between these dips. Power is the ability to affect the plot. We're 400 chapters after the time skip now, and while you could say Sanji didn't actually get many serious fights pre-time skip anyway, he did get a few, and in almost the same amount of story, on top of surrounding cool and consequential moments. But what we have had is as much, if not more, of Sanji being comedic, and all of that suffering that contribute to the impact and desire of these payoffs that haven't happened. This is what makes it so frustrating to Sanji fans and annoying to those who dislike Sanji. A lot of these times it's just a plot device that other characters could potentially have fulfilled. Any kind of injury involving blood loss in Fishman Island, for example. Fishman Island was painful. But what about Whole Cake Island, you might ask? Now, don't get me wrong, I did love a lot of Whole Cake Island. Tonally and structurally some of Oda's best work. Sanji had a few cool moments and that heart-wrenching flashback, but no definitive payoffs to punctuate the entire experience and ordeal. He had a minor payoff in making the cake, but it doesn't achieve the same kind of reward or catharsis for all of that Sanji foolishness and pain and losses. Nor does the act of making the cake relate very strongly to a character arc, particularly because Sanji is already a world-class chef. It's just him doing the thing that he could have probably done on day one when we were introduced to him. No growth or change was marked. For an example, it's like Robin reading the poneglyphs. When that happens, it is hype, it's exciting, it is game-changing. But there isn't really anything that's overcome in the action of just reading the poneglyphs that can be attributed to Robin's character as an accomplishment. Those are just story moments more than Robin moments, which to be clear isn't bad, it's just different focus. But when it comes to such a feat for Sanji, it doesn't really do anything to counterbalance all of those dips that precede it. Again, there's no significant mark or progression. I love the eventual story and dynamic between Sanji and Pudding, but even that ended up erased from his memories. Beautifully tragic in its implementation, especially in the anime, but again it was Sanji losing something key to his own growth, and again it was involving his relationship with a woman. Power is the ability to affect the plot, and the main way that's gonna happen in One Piece is through fights. A key and definitive win essentially caps one arc and creates a floor for the next. It's like a checkpoint or a save. With Sanji, we've yet to receive that, so with the small or minor payoffs like making the cake, squashing someone like Sheep's Head, and the rest, he basically just about does enough to bring us to a neutral state as an audience before falling all the way back down with gags and L's. Sanji is a combatant. Yes, he's a chef. Yes, strength isn't a part of his dream, but the way he affects the story is with fights, it's with schemes, it's with mental support in the midst of crucial battles, it's with coming clutch to a consequential degree, and we've just not had anywhere near enough of those moments to counterbalance that unique portrayal of consequential flaws, pain, and gags. And it's obviously more grueling when we experience it week to week. His main thing for the time skip was learning those supposed battle and strength increasing recipes, but even that has had little more than a passing reference. No tangible or at least acknowledged impact on the character or story whatsoever. So again, Sanji is a combatant, just not solely a combatant. My final point more quickly will be that this depiction also suffers from the perception of Sanji in story. We're influenced by the eyes of the character through which we view the story, and thus those collective moments of the crew laughing very much at Sanji, calling him pathetic or an idiot, color our perception somewhat. Another case where Big Mom suffers in the same way. Those again are usually balanced out by those significant feats such as the Gates of Justice or Mr. Prince, but we have very little of that post-time skip as a byproduct of this new Super Saga structure. The crew obviously respect Sanji and believe in his strength, but again, there's no proof to that in far too long. There's not been a payoff to this belief when they're proved right, and a side character that thinks Sanji is stupid or weak is proven wrong. We didn't even get to see Sanji definitively prove his strength to his family, except for an again off-screen skirmish with Yonji. The raid suit in particular made me worried because it would fundamentally change Sanji's combat design. I may be alone in this, but Sanji in a suit and dressed well is for sure a part of his appeal and adds to his signature and reputation, especially in these payoff moments that happen in fights. It just looks so much more boss when he wins and then straightens his tie or some shit. I don't know, man. The possibility of Oda taking that away for big fights doesn't sit too well with me. I'd never go as far as believing that Oda hates Sanji, but if you're willing to scrap that part of his design, I may begin to let that fear seep in a little bit. As far as I'm concerned, that would seem like Zoro without the bandana or something. So I'm very interested to see how the raid suit is incorporated into Sanji's power set and design long term. Anyway, power is how a character affects the story, but it's also the primary factor in earning respect, and Sanji's character has more moments of tenuous respect than anything else at this point in time. Though I will say chapter 1005 was a step in the right direction though. Sanji got to leave what could have been Khalifa 2.0, gave Robin some well-needed and deserved shine, and appears to be setting up that wider cast underestimation to be paid off in a big way. I'm looking forward to see what Brook and Robin have to offer as well. Finally, Sanji's fights are just cool and I want to see them. Been far too long since Diablo Jamba has done some real work. But that's all I really wanted to say. I had a previous scripts of this that had about an extra 2 pages of context and evidence, but I thought that since I don't have any followers, this might just be better as an introduction. This currently may just be a bit of a side project because I actually have another YouTube channel that I'm starting that's on a completely different subject. But if I end up with a little bit of a following here, or just some level of demand for this type of discussion or analysis, then I might redistribute my focus a little bit. So do like and subscribe if you want more from me. But otherwise, this has been a video from Polarising no Treks. Peace.